everyone, today we're going to be looking at a project that I set myself as a fun task to make over Christmas. I had the idea that I'd like to make something. I wasn't really sure what. As I like sci-fi, I thought that perhaps a Gauntlet would be a really interesting challenge. And I do a little bit of making, but this was going to test out all kinds of techniques and processes that I've only really dabbled in before. And I started off, as you can see, with just some cardboard and an old glove, and just trying to fit little sections there and trying to experiment with what would look nice. And I had the idea that I would try and incorporate into it this cool looking digital watch that I got from Amazon. It was very cheap, but super cheerful, as you'll see. So the first thing I needed to do was knock out the pin, and there it goes, and that holds on the strap because I didn't need that. What I instead wanted was just the watch itself, which has a really nice futuristic kind of readout. Looks like little energy bars or something. And this watch was only, I think it was less than £10. That was a really nice find. So I kind of designed the glove to fit around the aesthetics of this watch. And it's just a process of trial and error and seeing what might look right in terms of kind of aesthetic balance. As you can see, the watch itself would need some kind of housing to hold it in place, and also to kind of mask that it was just a watch. I didn't want it to look too much like, I just had a watch on my glove. I wanted to cover it up a little bit and integrate it into the design. And all of this process really is just off the top of my head. I made a couple of sketches and I had some kind of vague idea in my mind, but generally speaking, it's just a fun process of iteration, really. And I view this as like the first version of this Gauntlet. Certainly if I was to make it again, I'd be able to make it quicker and faster, and with all the lessons I learned from this version. And really that's the best way to do anything like this in a sort of creative process, is just to get stuck in, start making it, in my opinion. And you're going to learn a lot more from making terrible mistakes and having to fix them than you would ever if you just purely went on the basis of trying to read how to do it perfectly the first time, because that's not really that realistic, and in the end you'll just hold yourself back from actually, getting started with anything. And I wanted to use on this project a lot of techniques that I've never even tried that much before, and one of those was CAD and the 3D printer. And with CAD, I'm not particularly good at it by any means, but I found a program called Tinkercad online, which is free to use, and it's incredibly simple. I mean, if I can do it, you can do it. And I was able to make the complex shapes, relatively complex, for boxes for circuit boards and so on. Again, just like with anything creative, there's a lot of trial and error in this, but it was relatively simple to transfer all of my measurements from the cardboard components into the computer, and then you're able to rotate them and see them from any angle and chop them up into different parts ready to go into the printer. It was a lot of fun actually, and I was really surprised how quickly I was able to get into it. When it comes to actually printing it out, it's very, very simple. There's just a few settings to do with how fast you want the element to move, how hot you want it to get, and the resolution that you think you might need. For this project, I didn't want it to be that fine because it will also impact the amount of time each print would take, and I was certain that I would end up needing to print certain parts several times over after making little adjustments, because this was the first time I was using the printer on something as complex as this. Once finished, you end up with something that's sometimes a little bit messy and you need to clean it up, and that's what we're doing here. But it was just fun to have the parts fit together like this and see it realized in plastic what was previously just in cardboard. Now, more fancy printers and more time adjusting the settings would reduce the amount of cleanup that you would need to do, but I was very content with chipping these little bits off here. It wasn't much of a concern, and as I was doing so, I was able to look at the print in detail and see, just what parts I could have made a little bit more finer, any adjustments I could make to the design so it would fit better. But overall, I was pretty happy, and it's quite a soothing process anyway, this just chipping these little elements off and just getting it nice and clean. After a while, you'll have taken care of most of the bigger chunks with the pliers, and it's time to switch over to a file. I've got a fair few of these, and you can, I don't think, never have enough. This one's quite a small one with a fine point, and it's really good for getting into the corners where sometimes bits of blobs of molten plastic have built up. Also, just generally smoothing down the surface, and in between these parts here was particularly handy to have such a small instrument. It's also really nice just to kind of zen out, just smooth this stuff down, take your time, just relax. You don't really need much in the way of constant brain power. It's just a nice process. Every little movement of the file makes the model a little bit better. So with the preparation complete, I'd then move on to how these components were going to join up together. And for this I had the idea of using these little neodymium magnets. However, the ones I got unfortunately came with this adhesive already on it. And you might think, well, that's super handy, that's really helpful, but the adhesive itself has got no chance in heck of actually sticking anything to anything because it's quite weak, far weaker than the magnet itself. And therefore, if I just tried to use that on its own, they would have immediately come apart. So what I'm using here is nail polish remover and just a rolling motion with these Q-tips, and it all came off brilliantly. The next important thing to do was to just mark the poles of the magnets, so when I did glue them in place I wouldn't accidentally glue one half of them the wrong way up and end up with magnets that repelled each other rather than attracted each other, which would have been a bit of a bore, but not impossible to have fixed, and I was already prepared to make all kinds of mistakes and just really have some fun with this project because that's the best way to learn. But of course we're all human and we will get frustrated if we do things that are a bit daft. So I just wanted to make absolutely sure I knew which side was which. And now we're on to some real glue that should hold these guys in without too much trouble. And this is contact adhesive. It's really gloopy stuff. It actually comes in a metal tin, but I transferred it to this food dispensing kind of squeezy bottle. But as you can see, it still makes a terrible mess. Luckily, it's quite rubbery, so to remove it and smoosh it around, it's pretty easy. I put on a ludicrous amount the first time, as you can see there. I'm just pulling it off really easily with a tissue so I can have a more sensible amount. And it comes up really nicely. It's important to let this glue sit on both of the surfaces you're wishing to stick together until it's virtually dry, just tacky, not wet anymore. And then the idea is that when the two surfaces come together, they will bond instantly, and then you'll have a very, very strong connection between them. That is, of course, unless they get stuck to your hands before you have a chance to do that. And I had many occasions, especially with the magnets, which are absolutely tiny, where I'd get glue stuck to them, which would be stuck to me, which would be stuck to the table, and that was a whole bunch of fun. But after a little practice, it soon comes together, and you get an understanding of how this material moves about, and you're able to kind of control it and deposit it exactly where you need it in the amounts that you need. Just don't expect to be able to get it done perfectly the first time, absolutely correctly, because it is all over the place. So after a quick check to see how the glue's doing, it's time to get that contact happening. And you'll feel immediately as the two parts touch each other, they start to stick, and you really haven't got much tolerance to be able to waggle them around afterwards. You kind of have to get it right first time. I was very lucky because the design of these little boxes I'd made meant that the magnet would be held between the shape of the plastic itself, and therefore I didn't need to work too hard to make sure it was straight. I could just slot it straight in. Then it was time to use a Citadel product called Liquid Green Stuff, and this is great fun. This is a goopy liquid plastic, effectively. It just goes on like very thick paint, and I thought it would be a good idea to put a nice coat of this between any of the gaps that existed around the magnet and over the magnet itself, just to provide an extra layer of protection from the magnet being able to separate itself. It's almost like I'm encapsulating it in plastic, and of course I could have done that with a better design of the box itself, and at this moment, as I'm painting this goo onto the model, I was thinking exactly how I could have changed the model itself to incorporate a way of having the magnet so it could not break free under any stress. And that's one of the fun things about building things like this, is you really get the best ideas about improvements as you're building the first version. Obviously, if I'd have spent longer on the design phase, I might have anticipated something like this. But ultimately I'd given myself a deadline, which is another very important feature of any project, I think, is to give yourself a deadline, no matter how arbitrary. It really does help to filter out any unnecessary design elements that you might be keen on, and kind of distill the idea down into something that's just the essential stuff survives, so you can get it done. And the danger is, especially with myself, that without a deadline I could be working on this for months rather than 5 days, and always be thinking of other ways that I could procrastinate rather than getting stuck in. The green stuff doesn't take terribly long to dry, but I think I left it overnight. And then I started to smooth it down with a file, just so the two parts would be able to join up neatly. I wasn't too worried that I'd be stripping some of it off from the surface of the magnet, because I had another layer of a different product called Plasti-Dip, which comes in a spray can, and I knew I'd be applying that afterwards. It was mostly important that it just filled in the gaps around the edges and just helped to hold the magnet in place. So with the large pieces for the back of the glove prepared, I moved on to the individual finger sections, and these have a lot less stringing and little bubbles of plastic to worry about, and therefore after a quick check with the file, it was clear that you could actually deal with most of it with a nice big sheet of sandpaper. The nice straight edges of these pieces made using the file very simple, and it made using the sandpaper even more simple. Just by rubbing each of the edges along the sandpaper, different directions, it was very fast to smooth down every part of the surface that would be visible and that needed to be prepared for paint. Again, this is a very nice and relaxing process, especially when you've got so many components to prepare. Switching between the coarser and the finer grit sandpaper and just working on all of the sides and the top and the bottom to get them nice and smooth, one after the other. Once I'd used the large sheets, I then moved over to some individual nail files, these are just brilliant for getting fine control and just taking care of some of the rougher parts which are still left over from using the big sheets. They're also really cheap to buy and they last quite a long time as well. As you can see here, the large parts for the back of the hand have been given a coat of Plasti-Dip spray, and that has encapsulated the magnets. And here I'm just checking that that hasn't affected the workings of the magnets and that everything is sitting smoothly and is in the orientation that I'd planned it to be. As you can see, the watch has little parts to the design that cover up bits that I don't want to be seen from the outside. It's always nice when you've got all of the bits and bobs prepared and you can start to assemble them and really see everything coming together. These are some little details that I wanted to add, and I'm using Gorilla Glue here. It dries quite slowly, but during that drying process you have a great deal of control over the parts you're trying to stick. You can move them around and really get a fine adjustment, which is what I wanted, because as you can see there are lots of parts there that want to be parallel and square with each other, and if I used a fast drying glue there'd be a lot of pressure on trying to get it right first time, and that wouldn't be quite so fun. This glue is much more liquid than the contact glue, and just putting a nice coat on one surface is sufficient, and you can apply it straight away. And as you can see there, it skates around nicely, and now it's in place it can still be moved, and probably up to 10-15 minutes worth of adjustment time, and that was especially important for these smaller parts, because when you apply them you can't really see where it is unless you're using tweezers. You can't place it exactly where you want, and then the tweezers would get covered in glue, and then you've got a whole new batch of exciting problems. So it was fun just to plonk these on and then just skate them around over a period of minutes, knowing that there's no pressure and this glue really needs an afternoon to set completely. them right, looking at it from several angles, making sure that they're not in the wrong place. And even if I wanted to move them quite radically, if I wanted to completely change it at this point, it's very easy just to pick them off and remove the glue with a tissue and try again. Basecoating the finger parts, and what I've got here is a piece of cardboard wrapped in tape, and then some two-sided tape on top of that in a couple of strips, and it just enables me to very quickly place these elements ready for painting in a way that when I use the spray they won't be blown all over the place and fall onto the floor and get ruined. The one thing to bear in mind with this is that tape is really quite sticky, and once you've painted one side and you want to flip all the parts to paint the other, it's a good idea just to give that other side a quick sanding down, very fine sandpaper, or just rub it on a piece of plastic or something like that, just to take away any of the residual stickiness that might come with the tape when you remove them. And here we are in a much better ventilated room. It's actually the garage of the house, so no other humans are in here because this stuff can be quite nasty. I've got a mask on and a glove as well because it really does stick to you. And as you can see, I'm just painting these in quick bursts. It doesn't have to be terribly neat, especially as this is the underside of all of the finger parts here. And just a quick coat, very light, on all of the sides, and let that dry for about 20 minutes, and maybe hit it with a second coat before turning them upside down and doing the other side. Now, the leather glove itself had a Velcro fastening, and I wanted to make that permanent by putting a rivet in it, and this is actually really good fun. You use this hole punch here, it's good for getting rid of any frustrations because you have to give it a real stiff whack. And as you're hitting it here, what you're actually doing is punching a hole through the leather with this device, and as I'm going through several pieces of leather here, I really needed to hit it a lot harder than I was doing. But as we're through now, the leather ends up remaining encapsulated within the tool, and you just get a perfect hole all the way through. Then I select the rivet that I'm going to use, which is like a off-bronze type coloured rivet here, just in case it was visible. I wanted something that wasn't too shiny. I place one side in the metal tool underneath, and then using a hammer, just give the rivet itself a firm whack with the other part of the tool, and this will enclose the leather in both sides of the rivet, and that's not coming undone in a hurry, so it's very secure and much more secure than the Velcro was, especially this cheap glove, so the Velcro was really quite weak. Now I wanted to make this glove look a little bit weathered, and that would apply to the paint job, but of course it must also apply to the leather, otherwise that would look really strange. So here I'm just roughing it up by wearing the glove, going outside and scraping it up and down the wall. And as you can see, that's pretty effective in aging this glove and distressing the leather very, very fast. One of the fun things I really wanted to try with this project is some electronics, and I haven't really done a lot of this, but just after a little bit of research I was able to put together a very simple circuit using this breadboard. I wanted to have a switch that lit a number of different LEDs. One of the interesting things is that the LEDs actually require different voltages depending on their colour and brightness, and therefore I found I needed a resistor in order to bring down the voltage coming from the battery for a couple of the LEDs, but not all of them. So the circuit needed to be split into two parts to account for the different types of LED that I wanted to use. So once I had tested the circuit on the breadboard and saw that everything was working as I'd hoped it was, I then moved on to my own little circuit board, and that is actually a blank circuit board that I've sawn in half, as I only needed a small part of it. I'm just fixing it into these helping hands here, which really are very, very useful. Now my soldering technique is really quite poor, but as you can see, it does work, and it's something I want to get much, much better at, and the only way I'm going to do that is by practicing. As you can see here, I'm basically creating a trace along the back of the circuit board with solder, and that trace will lead to the different components which will be pinned into the other side. first parts I attached were the battery and the switch, and then I moved on to the resistor. I put the pins through the holes, I bent them back, and then it was easy to solder them in place before trimming off the excess. If I were to give any tips on soldering, and I am by no means qualified to do so, but just in my experience, heating the component and then adding the solder to the iron, then pulling the solder away, then pulling the iron away, is definitely the way to go. When I first started soldering, I would be tempted to melt the solder directly onto the iron and then try to apply that to the component, and that never really works. It just ends up as a tremendous mess. Another key part to this is patience. You will definitely make mistakes if you haven't done this before, and ultimately you might end up with something that looks like a bit of a mess, but as you can see here, as long as it functions, we're running on our deadline, which is making us have a reason to keep pushing forward and not stop and second guess ourselves. And as you can see here, each one of these little solders is getting a little bit neater than the previous one, and the next project will therefore hopefully be neater still. And it's also important to just have some fun here. You know, this is a novel thing if you don't do it that often, and it's really nice when you've finally finished your circuit and it works just as you were hoping it would. Once the circuit board had been put inside the plastic shell, I didn't need to glue it in place because it actually was a push fit. I was hoping that the LEDs inside their little containers there would hold it in place, and they did. So I'm just using the end of the file just to push everything in place and make sure it's all tightly fitted and no wires are touching any parts that they shouldn't and stopping it working. As you can see, the little housings for the lights really look good, and I was very pleased when I took the lid for the first time, and with the magnets it just clipped on. Turning the circuit on for the first time with this lid on was a great fun moment, because this little design, however basic, had been in my head for a few days, and it was great to see it come together. And now we're back with the double-sided tape, and we're ready to do some airbrushing. And this is great fun. I've always wanted an airbrush, and I was fortunate enough to buy one recently. It's just the cheapest Iwata airbrush, which comes with its own little compressor pump, but it's perfect for everything I need it to do, and just gives you a really nice finish that I think is better than a can of spray paint, and certainly better than trying to coat large flat areas with a traditional paintbrush. I chose metallic paints for this project, and these paints are actually really interesting. They shift between two different colours depending on the viewing angle, and that gives a really nice finish to something, especially something sci-fi like this. The airbrush itself is quite quiet. I've pulled down the sound here because actually all you'd be hearing is the extractor fan from the little painting booth rather than the airbrush itself. I use a booth because it helps with just drawing out all of the excess paint that's flying around in the air above the element that I'm painting, and I don't want it to then fall back down and create bubbles on the surface. Also, if the paint was toxic, it would help to pull out any fumes, but this paint doesn't really have a horrible smell or anything. However, a cheap painting booth is a good purchase because it just helps contain the mess that you will make. As you can see on the bottom of this plastic here, there's lots and lots of previous projects that have been painted and have left their mark, and I'd rather it be there than all over the dining room table, which is where it would otherwise be. Now, this paint requires many very thin coats to achieve the effect, and after about 3 or 4 of them you will need to clean the airbrush because it will start to clog the mechanism due to having metal flakes and being relatively thick. As you can see, this first coat really almost looks invisible. It's really interesting to watch it go on, and you're looking at the bottle and thinking, when does this start looking good? And the answer is, after about 4 coats. Eventually you start to see the colour halfway through, and then every additional coat from that point on just makes it look better and better until a point of diminishing returns, and you'll see that. As we approach the final coat here, you'll see how much more reflective and silver it's starting to look. As I mentioned before, when I roughed up the leather, I wanted this to look quite weathered, so we are going to go and apply some washes to the plastic parts here that we've airbrushed. Now, I could of course produce a version of this glove that's brand new, if you like, and we wouldn't do this step. In fact, we would probably add maybe even a gloss varnish or something to the outside. I printed out an extra one of these finger pieces and used that to test both a gloss and matte spray lacquer, and concluded that for this version we weren't going to need either, because the washes going on like this actually looked much more effective. And this is an old sock I'm using, in fact, to smudge the ink in there, and it's really effective. It's easy to use with your fingers and get a real nice smudged effect. Each paint brings with it a different tone, of course. We've got all kinds of reds and greens and blues I decided upon, and you have to be judicious as you're applying this. You don't want to put too much on because it's really difficult to take off. Once it's on there, it will start to stain the paint underneath, and therefore just adding a little at a time and seeing how that looks. You can always add more. It's a really enjoyable process, and you can take as long as you want. each time you add something here, you are bringing out the three-dimensionality of the item that you're working on, and also the believability of it when you just catch a glance of it. If something's too shiny, too precise, it starts to look a little bit fake, but adding some weathering just seals it into reality, I think, and it really is a lot of fun. Looking at these pieces up close, we can see that they've just taken on a different tone, and we move that on to the larger pieces here, where you can imagine these would have a lot of wear on the glove because these are controls of sorts. So we'll put some nice grime around the edges, and as you can see, they really start to pop out as you do that. And that's what we want, because imagining that this is a prop for film or TV or the stage, you want it to pop out from a long distance away. What it looks like extremely close up is much less important. It really has to communicate what it is from a good distance, and this process really helps that. once again using our trusty sock to remove the excess and just leave the paint sitting in all of the nooks and crannies, and you can see the difference it makes. was nice and relaxing to do. I hope it was to watch as well. We can see all of the staining on these pieces here, and I think it really brings out their detail. Now, starting with the finger parts here, I've added some black paint in little splodges, and I'm just going to do the same now to the larger parts. And this is the base coat for a different process. What we're going to do is make it look like the paint has chipped off, and therefore as a result it will really help sell this plastic as being metal instead. The paint is quite thick and dries quite quickly, and you only really need one coat. But if you want to do two, that's fine if the colour underneath is very strong. You don't need to be precise here either. You just need to think about a bit of lore, how these chips would have happened, and put them in areas that you think make sense. Is looking very grubby indeed now. It's time to move on to the next part, which is to paint in the silver. And you're going to cover most of the black here, just leaving a thin edge at the top. And this gives the illusion that the paint has chipped away, and you've actually chipped it down past the base coat and to the bare metal underneath. This starts to get a little bit hallucinogenic after a while. It's really quite relaxing to put these parts in. You can do it very quickly. Again, you don't need to concentrate, but you will find that you will drift off as you're following these little smudges around. But you will also notice that it's coming alive as you're doing it. Looking at it up close, it's looking really interesting now. There's just another couple of things we need to do to bring this all together. And one of the first is to add a much brighter silver to the center of these chips. And when we look at that up close now, they really shine. And it really shows on these bigger parts as well. It makes a big difference. Next, we're going to add an edge highlight, and this requires a little bit more precision, but it's very easy to do. One of the tricks here is to get the balance of the pigment and the water in the paint just right. You don't want it too liquidy, and you certainly don't want it too dry. Once you've experimented with a few edges, you'll find that you can just use the very side of the brush, and it will glide very easily down the sharp edges and bring out all of their detail. And it really emphasizes the metallic, worn look. On these finger parts, I also added a line that traced the crease along the wings of the piece there, just to bring out that edge. Also, on these larger parts I did the same. Next is to add a final little splash of colour, and this is a little bit of foam I'm using on a tissue, and I want to get as much of this paint off as I can onto the tissue, and then I'm just going to dab. And as you can see, I've already applied some silver in this manner, and now I'm going to do the same to a bright orange and a brown, and this will add some grime and some rust to some of the corners that I just want to pick out and highlight. looking pretty interesting to me. I think it's really been quite an effective process, and quite a mucky one as well, as you can see from my fingers, but lots of fun. Finally, I just thought that some black stippling as well would just add another little piece. I'm using it very, very sparingly indeed, but as it stands out very strongly against the other bright colours, it helps to emphasize them with an increase in contrast. Gauntlet parts are almost done. The weathering effect enables you to age something and just make it look a little bit more believable, especially when you're trying to make plastic look like metal. Now I thought it would be fun to add some transfers onto these controls here. So I'm adding a product called Hardcoat, which is effectively like a gloss lacquer, and that's going to provide a nice smooth surface that I can add the transfers to. Once the surface is completely covered, you just leave it to dry, and then you're left with a shiny surface that the transfer will stick to easily. Now these are just transfers that I got from an old model kit. They're spare, I'm not using them for anything else, and I thought that they fit first thing to do is to apply a nice healthy amount of water to each one of these transfers. They get activated by the water, but they need to soak in it for about 30 seconds to become mobile. After waiting a little while, we can now poke at them with the brush and we can see that they're moving around, so they're ready to use. Once they're layered onto the lacquered surface, you can move them around with the brush, and they'll be quite happy to be mobile until you squeeze all of the water out of them with a tissue and set them in place. You apply them with a pair of tweezers, and I find it best to wet the surface first and then just literally poke and prod the transfer until it joins the surface. You can move them around on the surface for as long as you want, as long as they're kept wet. As soon as you dry them out, they will stick. And here I've just added a little bit of paint to the end of my finger, and I'm just tapping these buttons to add some grime over the transfers so they don't stick out too much, in contrast to the weathering we've done elsewhere. Now this is another product called Lamium Medium, and it is effectively a matte lacquer, and once the transfers have dried, I'm just putting a layer of this over the top, and this serves two purposes. One, it will seal the transfer in place so it can't get scraped off by accident, and number two, it'll remove that gloss finish that we had before and tamp it back down to matte to match the rest of the painting. Now the painting has been finished, it's time to assemble the glove, and as you can see here, the first thing I did was to mark out the areas that I would be applying the glue. I just used a normal permanent marker in silver so it would stand out against the leather. This is the same contact adhesive as I used before, so I used the same technique. I was very grateful to have the squeezy bottle because otherwise it's quite difficult to control from the tin. And I'm just using a Q-tip here to spread it around. Both of the parts to be glued get a coating, and the glue itself actually starts to break down the base coat of the paint, so you get a bit of black goop starting to appear. But that actually is a bit of a bonus as it turns out, because when the glue sets, it'll actually set with a black tint inside it, which will make it a lot less visible. After leaving the glue on both sides to sit for a while, maybe 5-10 minutes, I then press fit both parts together and they immediately bond. I'm using a fair amount of pressure here because I want to be able to get it as flat as possible. I quickly test to see how that works and if it will lift off with my hand inside the glove. And give it another quick push just to make sure that it's seated correctly. Applying the glue for the housing for the watch because it's quite a small area. Although the glue does dry quicker than the Gorilla Glue, you still have a good amount of time to get it in the right place and move it around before it starts to set. Putting this part in place squeezed out a lot of the glue from underneath, which was pretty inevitable because I was quite generous with the amount I applied. But it was important to just remove a lot of that from the voids, otherwise when it dries solid, they'll stop the watch from sitting in those spaces, and I need those gaps to exist in order to hold the watch in place. As I go on to apply the glue to the fingertips, it's worth noting that having the occasional spare part in a process like this is really useful because you can use those to test how long the glues take to go off, how long the paints take to dry, and also how the glues and the paints react to each other. You don't want to have a nasty surprise when you're using finished painted parts and they get completely melted by a glue. As you can see here, the glue is still quite tricky to work with in some ways because it's quite stringy, but it is also quite easy to cope with those strings if you just exercise a little bit of patience and kind of pick them off as they develop and stop them from drying and causing a mess. It was a fun moment when I put these parts on because the glove really started to come alive, and I did a quick test to see if I could still move my fingers. And for this finger as well, it was much more useful to actually have my hand inside the glove when I applied this part, because I couldn't get the right sort of purchase without it. Final assembly of something like this is always a really great moment because you really start to know that the project's coming to an end and all of the things you've visualized are coming to fruition. So it's quite relaxing to just assemble it and enjoy it coming to life. This thumb piece presented its own challenges because it's very different from all of the others. And to get it in just the right place so you could actually still bend your thumb just required a little bit of hand-eye coordination, trying to visualize where it's going to sit and make some markings so I could put the glue in the right place. So I'm just checking and rechecking exactly where I want it to go. Now, if I had have glued it in the wrong place, because these elements are made from plastic and the glove is leather, I could easily peel these off. It would require quite a bit of strength, but you're not going to tear anything too badly. The glove will resist tearing and the plastic of course will be fine, but what you would have to do is scrape all of this glue off before applying a new layer, and that would be a little bit of a grim task, but it could absolutely be done. Again, after some cleanup of excess glue, it's still a little bit messy around the edges, but I actually quite like that. It ties into the glove being distressed. I could clean it up, but I decided to keep some of it there. And then we moved on to the real fun, which is seating the watch in the holder. And then finally clipping on the magnetic top. With that in place, I turned on the circuit and checked all the lights, and then took the final piece and snapped it into place. I really hope you enjoyed watching this come together with me, and I also really hope that you make your own thing and share your videos too. This isn't a prop from a TV show, a movie, or a comic or anything. This is just from my own head. I just had a little vision of something I wanted to make and just dove straight into it. And it's amazing what you can do with just a few hours and a few tools and a little determination. Remember, it's not about trying to make something perfect straight away, trying to make something completely incredibly precise. It's just about making something, and from that you will learn so much, and you will just be able to iterate and iterate upon that learning and that design process and that little artistic journey. And ultimately the things you make will get better and better each time. Set yourself a goal and a deadline. Have a lot of fun and make whatever's in your